Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Joseph Asaf, and I'm the president of the Thomistic Institute chapter here at Benedictine College. We're grateful to welcome Professor Erik Dempsey to give today's lecture titled C.S. Lewis's Screwtape Letters and the Problems of the Modern Human Being. Before beginning, we just have a few announcements. First, we would like to thank Pace Bene for catering this evening's event. Secondly, to join Benedictine's chapter of the Thomistic Institute, please see the sign-ups just outside the doors. Elections for the TI officer positions will be upcoming, and again, you can be notified of this through signing up in the back. Please mark your calendar for the upcoming lecture on March 20th, titled, Why Have Kids? How Having Children Changed My Life by Christopher Kaiser. And now for our esteemed guest. Erik Dempsey is an associate professor of instruction in the departments of government, classics, and religious studies at the University of Texas. He is also the assistant director of the Thomas Jefferson Center for the Study of Core Texts and Ideas. He has taught at the University of Texas for over 10 years. During that time, he has offered classes such as the history of political philosophy, the Bible and its interpreters, and literature. His favorite classes to teach are Jerusalem and Athens, a class comparing the political, moral, and theological ideas of the Hebrew Bible to Aristotle's, and the Question of Relativism, a class on what he considers to be the central moral and philosophical quandary of our time. He writes primarily about Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas and is currently studying John Locke's commentaries on St. Paul's epistles. He is also an Eagle Scout. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Erik Dempsey.
Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you, Joseph, for that kind introduction. Thank you also to Therese and Isaac for being such wonderful hosts. I'm delighted to be here at Benedictine. It's Benedictine, right? Benedictine University. It's Benedictine College. It's right there. Okay. Benedictine College, speaking on C.S. Lewis for the Thomistic Institute. I somehow doubt that this evening's talk is going to make as much of an impact nationally as a talk given by a certain Kansas City Chiefs kicker just a few months ago at this illustrious institution, but I'm happy to be part of that history. So my topic tonight is C.S. Lewis's Screwtape letters, and I'm speaking about them insofar as they offer insight into the problems of the modern human being. I know that's a bit of an odd topic for a Thomistic Institute lecture, since Lewis, and I don't think I'm bursting anyone's bubble here, was not a Catholic. But Lewis has long been recognized by many Catholics as a very fruitful intellectual partner. Pope Benedict, for instance, spoke with admiration about his writings and appealed to them in some of his public lectures. So whatever Lewis's views on Catholic ecclesiology may be, it seems to me that there's a lot of common ground between him and the teaching of the Catholic Church. There are two intertwined topics that I'm especially going to focus on tonight that I believe are important for Catholics to talk and think about, and topics on which I myself, I think, have learned a great deal from Lewis. One is the simple official theme of this talk, modernity. Lewis, as I suppose you know, or may not know, studied and taught philosophy at Oxford, which for him meant, at least in large part, the study of the thought of the past. He has remarkable treatments of Renaissance and medieval literature and philosophy. That study left him very able to understand what's distinct about the modern world. Some propositions, some dispositions that we now very much take for granted were not shared, have not been shared across all times and places, and they are, in Lewis's view, rather questionable. So modernity is my first great theme, as my title announced. The second related theme on which I'm going to speak and again, on which I believe I've learned a lot from Lewis, is nature. I'm going to expand on that in the body of the talk, but beginning with his study of the ancients and expanded upon by everything he did, Lewis developed a very robust notion of what nature means, what it means to have a nature. He saw it as something in which human beings could find purpose, could even find a law, and where the imprint of God's wisdom and will could be found. Nature, for Lewis, is a product of divine providence and points the way for individuals to rise from looking at creation to the vocation of devotion to God. For Lewis, it seems to me that one of the great effects or consequences of modernity has been to create a distance between human beings and their ownmost nature. Human beings are, as it were, naturally designed to become aware of God. They have certain natural purposes and natural tasks and works that they perform. That, by the way, is ground that he shares with the ancients, and one of the reasons I think it's appropriate to talk about Lewis in a context like this is that nature is at least supposed to be, and I think rightly is, a subject that Catholics like me have in common with people of all different faiths and all different backgrounds. It's the common core that we can all refer to, so Lewis is a good partner on that. So one of the great effects of modernity, I think, has been to create this distance between human beings and their ownmost nature. The intellectual presuppositions, and just as importantly, the habits of thought of the modern world have a tendency to pull us away from thinking about nature and encountering nature in its full and complete original sense. If, as we so often do, we take modern science as the only necessary and valid way of understanding nature, we find it purged of all purpose, the natural moral law seems unintelligible, and the connection to God highly tenuous at best. In a later part of my talk, I'm going to expand more on what that means, but to put it in a nutshell, Lewis thinks that the modern world, both in its intellectual bearing and in the habits it instills, keep people from encountering even their own natures as they are. So those are the three basic issues I mean to the two basic interconnected issues I mean to discuss tonight. What does it mean to be a modern human being? What is meant by human nature? And what are the features of the modern world that create distance between human beings and what I'm calling their nature? Now, in this discussion, I am mostly going to refer to what I promised to refer to in the title, Lewis's Screwtape letters. I suppose most of you, I don't really know, but I suppose that most of you here tonight have read that. I think it's a wonderful book. It's full of delightful aphorisms, punchy formulations, and it's just endlessly engaging and clever. In my opinion, it's one of the most readable books that's ever been written. Like, you can't put it down once you start. You just want to go through letter after letter and see what charming little formulation or clever witticism Lewis has stuck in there. One thing that, to me, comes across really clearly when I read this book is what a great teacher Lewis is. He has this amazing way of pointing things that you immediately recognize you need to think about, and he tries to get you to notice things that you haven't even realized you believe. I also love how, if I can use a word that might sound a little trite, human the whole book is, despite the fact that no human speaks in the book, really. How much it takes people as they are, looking at both their virtues and their vices, right? And looking at the lives that they live. Lewis was a great student of philosophy. Pope Benedict even calls him a philosopher. But he writes, for the most part, without any technical jargon. And in those rare cases that he does, he goes out of his way to connect it to things all human beings recognize and talk about. He talks about ordinary life, about work, love, anger, irritation, family, country, all of it. And the transition from those topics to his discussions of the sublime, to his discussion of God and the highest things, is absolutely seamless. There aren't very many books you read where you come away thinking both that you'd like to take a graduate seminar with the author and that you'd like to go out for a beer with him, but in my opinion, Lewis pulls it off in this text. Now, having gone on a little bit, probably too long, about how much I like it, I should point out that Screwtape is a rather unusual text. So before trying to bring out his thoughts on the two topics I have in mind, again, that's modernity and nature, I want to say a few words about how to read a book like this. Briefly, how are we to understand a book where the only character from whom we hear directly is literally a devil? So this is, if you like, this is short part 1, and then part 2 is on modernity, and part 3 is on nature. Okay? So I'm guessing that I think most of you know the conceit of the novel, but I'll explain it briefly anyway. Screwtape Letters is an epistolary novel comprised of letters from Screwtape, an experienced devil, who has, so it seems, brought in many souls to the devil's service to his nephew named Wormwood. Wormwood is in a long process of trying to win for their common master. Screwtape refers to him as our father below, right? Funny. The soul of a human being whom he refers to as his, quote, patient, unquote. Screwtape guides Wormwood as he attempts in several ways to tempt this young man. He ultimately, and again, spoiler if you haven't read it, but you know, you're the one who came to a lecture on this book. At the end, he fails. The so-called patient finds his way to church, falls in love with a very decent-seeming and very Christian woman, and finally dies fighting for the British in World War I, with his soul in a state that, per the admission of old Uncle Screwtape, has him on his way to salvation. Screwtape Letters is a classic, or Screwtape himself, is a classic example of what my colleagues over in the Department of English call an unreliable narrator. He very obviously does not speak for the author. Virtually the opposite is true. Lewis later said, I was told, by the way, just yesterday, that I only learned this, Lewis apparently had some reservations about the conception of this book, occupying the mind of a devil so often, right? But he did say in his own writing that once you have an idea like this, it exploits itself spontaneously. That's a quote. It's immediately funny, especially when old Screwtape bumbles or shows his own vices. And there's something elegant about the way it's written. When you hear beliefs or presuppositions you've taken for granted your whole life stated by a servant of the devil, and even described as tools that he's using to try to capture your soul, you can't help but start to wonder whether you were right to hold them. But it also means that Screwtape requires its readers to peel away a couple of layers of the onion before they get at what Lewis must really mean. The pirouette each reader needs to perform, reversing every claim Screwtape makes, is only the first step, right? Inverting everything he says. That gets you pretty far with the book, but it's not quite enough. As Lewis's brief preface to the book states, none of the claims of old Uncle Screwtape is reliable. Devils are, first of all, liars, and one can't assume that what Screwtape says is true, quote, even from his own angle, unquote. But it's not just that Screwtape is dishonest. That'd be tricky enough. he might not be, and I would say is not, entirely in command of his own thoughts. For as Lewis also says, and here I quote again, there is wishful thinking in hell as well as on earth. If Screwtape were perfectly clear-sighted, but had the exact wrong intentions, then the opposite of what he recommends would always be the correct advice. But Screwtape is neither fully honest nor fully clear-sighted, and so readers need to take the additional step of correcting Screwtape from his own point of view, seeing where his account of things isn't true. To put all of that more simply, on my reading, Lewis does write an awful lot of truth into Screwtape's diagnosis of the world and of the modern world, but not the complete truth. This is still a devil talking to us, and a devil who doesn't have the clarity of sight that an angel would. So we should not always trust Screwtape, nor should we always distrust him in exactly the same way. And with those cautions in mind, I'm going to try to proceed to explain some of what I think this book is meant to convey. So part 2, Screwtape on the modern world. This book is set in the early 20th century, right before and then during World War I. That's not an accident. Screwtape talks often about the peculiar fate of the modern human being, about the specific vices and blind spots that are products of modern life. According to the novel's conceit, those are not mere accidents of which devils can take advantage. Screwtape describes at least some of them as part of a deliberate plan on the part of the devils to corrupt human beings and win them away from Screwtape's so-called enemy, that is, from God himself. It's an interesting fact, by the way, and I would say this is not what I wrote, but it's of some interest that we who live in the 20th, 21st century, we who live in the modern age, are very inclined to talk and think about ourselves as modern, as belonging to a specific age, not just as belonging to a specific people or group or country or religion, but we have a sense that our time in world history means that there's something distinctive about us. We're not the first group in history that had that feeling, but I would say it's more pronounced now than ever. That's one of the reasons it's such a fertile theme for a person like Lewis to take up. So I've said that he understands modernity, or at least parts of modernity, as a plan hatched by devils. What are the contours of this plan? How does the whole infernal bureaucracy work to change the world and make it more difficult for human beings to know and devote themselves to the great enemy, as it's put? In the first couple of letters, Screwtape opens this question up. He has an awful lot to say about modern habits, by which he means, above all, habits of thinking. There are certain ways that modern human beings tend to think, certain ways that they tend to approach questions that they have picked up habitually. That is, not through careful and explicit thinking, but just by having imbibed them, just because they're part of these habits, when one develops these habits because they're part of one's milieu. The first one of those that Screwtape mentions is a certain resistance to argument or reason as such, at least when it comes to questions about how they should live their own lives. Modern human beings, Screwtape says, tend to be less receptive to the idea that they can and should live in light of a truth that they have seen for themselves and arrived at by reason than people of the past had been. In a way, the whole idea of the truth comes into question in the modern age. At least the idea that the truth is useful or it's worth knowing seems to come into question. That's one of the great footholds that his diabolical bureaucracy uses in capturing the souls of its so-called patients. Screwtape's first words to his nephew, in fact, are a warning about the danger of trying to use argument to corrupt his patience. Patient. The trick, he says, in winning his victim for damnation is not to assemble arguments against belief in God. Far more effective is cultivating indifference, an unwillingness to listen to arguments as such. The arguments for, say, materialism or atheism might have been far more effective in centuries past. But now, Screwtape suggests, the primary means, the most effective means by which he'll win souls is not corrupt reasoning, but distraction, but rather with distraction from any kind of reasoning at all. In the past, people, and here I quote Screwtape, still connected thinking with doing and were prepared to alter their way of life as the result of a chain of reasoning. But he says, we, and we there is him and his devilish friends, right? But we have largely altered that. What has been instilled in people instead is a notion of what he calls real life, in which honest, serious thinking about one's situation, one's real situation, plays little part. Screwtape's memorable advice is that attending to universal issues is itself a fatal habit, and it is far better to fix the patient's attention on the stream, here I'm quoting, on the stream of immediate sense experiences, unquote, than to let him engage in any meaningful reflection. The devils, he says, have won a great victory in getting that word, that phrase, real life, to be used for that constant stream of immediate concerns that people need to face. He talks about the pressure of the ordinary as enslaving human beings, and says that such devices as the weekly press, as he puts it. Can you imagine a time when the weekly press seemed like an oppressive flood of news? But he says that devices like the weekly press, and as he puts it elsewhere, the bus and the newsboy will occupy people's attention instead of, I would say, how their soul stands with respect to God. They end up lacking even the capacity to think about themselves in terms of bigger issues, and therefore are unable even to begin to take themselves seriously. Now, I should note, I don't think that Lewis believes this is an absolutely uniquely modern phenomenon. Human beings, of course, at all times and places are distractible. But it's been strengthened in the current age by certain features of our world that make us more reluctant to listen to reason and less able to think about our lives in terms of the truth, right? In terms of the truth that we have argued and seen and reasoned to for ourselves, right? So what are those things, right? What are those particularly modern things? There's, as I've said, I think the flood is much worse in modernity than it was elsewhere. Yeah, except for, yeah, fine, okay. There was a worse flood before modernity, but the flood of information is worse in modernity than it had been before. But I also want to look at two specific habits of thinking. I don't even think they quite rise to the level of being philosophies or arguments, right? But two habits of thinking to which Screwtape points that have made it more difficult for us to engage in serious reasoning, serious thinking about our own lives. The first of those has to do with modern science, right? Now, Screwtape, also in that first letter, warns Wormwood against trying to make use of science as a teaching to corrupt his patient, right? If you make a scientific argument, that you shouldn't believe in God, or you make a scientific argument that the world is made only out of material and matter, and that there's no super sensory realm that human beings can perceive, you at least have the effect of raising a question for them. And if someone tells you the world is material, nothing but matter and motion, you can at least think, well, maybe it's not, right? Screwtape's strategy is more insidious than that. Let me read what he says to Wormwood. Do not attempt, he says, to use science, I mean the real sciences, as a defense against Christianity. They will positively encourage him, that's the patient, to think about realities he can't touch and see. There have been sad cases among the modern physicists. If he must dabble in science, keep him on economics and sociology. Don't let him get away from that invaluable real life. But the best of all is to let him read no science, but to give him a grand general idea that he knows it all, and that everything he happens to have picked up in casual talk and reading is the results of modern investigation. Do remember that you are there to fuddle them. From the way some of you young fiends talk, someone might suppose it was our job to teach, right? So it's striking. Screwtape doesn't even want Wormwood to use modern science itself to try to persuade the patient. He just wants to instill in him a certain habit of thinking, a dogmatic habit of thinking that supposes that modern science has settled all the fundamental questions. It speaks to a kind of modern arrogance, but one that people take in a very easygoing way. We as moderns can move past all the great challenges of the thought of the past because we know better. And modern science tells us we know better. Well, I have spent a fair amount of time around thoughtful modern scientists, and I can tell you they know full well they don't know better. They know full well that there are still questions, that there are still philosophic questions that a serious person needs to raise. This is one of the features of Lewis's thought that Pope Benedict particularly likes, by the way, and he uses the term scientism rather than science to describe this habit of thinking. Second big habit of thinking that I want to mention is the idea of history, the specifically modern idea of history and the way that we moderns engage in the study of history. In letter 27, much later in the text, Screwtape talks about the remarkable success that devils have had in corrupting souls by inculcating the, quote, historical point of view, unquote. I'll read a little again. This is letter 27, if you've got your book with you. The historical point of view, put briefly, means that when a learned man is presented with any statement in an ancient author, the one question he never asks is whether it is true. He asks who influenced the ancient writer and how far the statement is consistent with what he said in other books, and what phase in the writer's development or in the general history of thought it illustrates and how it affected later writers, or in and how often it has been misunderstood, especially by the learned man's own colleagues, and what the general course of criticism on it has been for the last 10 years, and what is the present state of the question. To regard the ancient writer as a possible source of knowledge, to anticipate what he said could possibly modify your thoughts or your behavior, this would be rejected as unutterably simple-minded. It's hard not to see a description of much of our current approach to education in what Screwtape says here. Rather than looking at the thought of the past as a source of truth and understanding, it becomes a kind of cabinet of outdated curiosities. Interesting and influential, maybe, part of a fascinating story, but not something that is capable of teaching us in the here and now. Pope Benedict, again, commenting on this passage, says that, quote, scholarly activity, and I would add, by the way, the scholarly activity insofar as it trickles down to classrooms, ranging from college classrooms to high schools to middle schools and elementary schools. I've been to enough of those to know you can teach those students too. But he says, scholarly activity carried on in such a manner has the effect of immunizing against the truth. I find that statement particularly bracing. The effect of this historicizing approach is to make the ideas of the past seem dead, seem not to be arguments we should think about, and that have the potential to get us to live and think differently, right? There's an awful lot more I could say about the habits of the modern world, and in question session, if you want, I'll say more about it. Modern moral presuppositions, the flood of information, all serve in one way or another this purpose of distracting us from a simple encounter with the truth, right? Or if not the truth, at least a simple encounter with the very simple but very important questions that Lewis means for us to ask. One of the things I love most about this book is the way that Lewis will occasionally pop his own head out a little bit and say things like, with an argument, surely the most important question is not where it came from or who it influenced, but whether it's true. Surely, if you're thinking about whether or not to perform an action, the question is not how it fits into some historical scheme or project, but whether, and these are his three questions, it's prudent, whether it's righteous, and whether it's possible, right? In a way, I think what Lewis wants to encourage through this book is a move away from not just jargon, but currents of thought that one finds in modernity to a much simpler, more naive perspective. That's one of the things I've always found most attractive about his thought. And now in this next section of the talk, which is a little shorter, I'd like to say a little bit about what Lewis means to convey about nature, right? Human nature above all, but nature. As I mentioned before, Screwtape suggested to Wormwood that he try to keep his patient immersed in the ordinary, the things that he described as real life. The first time he uses that term, ordinary, he tells Wormwood that he can't help but see how enslaved human beings are to it. He actually bemoans the advantage that God has by having become human himself. His nephew would never have that taste or awareness for how immersive, how all-encompassing ordinary life could seem to be. But I think that this is actually one of the keys to the book as a whole. Screwtape doesn't really understand what it's like to be a human being, and so he doesn't really understand what ordinary life in its full meaning is. It seems to me that ordinary for Lewis has, and this is one of those things where I'm saying you have to go more than doing the simple pirouette of reversing what he says. You have to see what's contained, what he's missing when he tries to describe the situation, right? So the fact that the ordinary has a deep meaning, it seems to me, is something that Screwtape is not able to see. Ordinary concerns are not empty, nor are they simply distractions from the pure and good world of spirit. Properly understood, ordinary life exists within the realm of nature, and nature is God's creation. Screwtape talks an awful lot about the world of spirit, a world that he sees as wholly good, I think, and a world of nature and materiality, which he sees, if not exactly as wholly bad, at least as very much beneath him, not worthy of the attention of a high-minded figure. He's even happy to take pot shots at God, right, for engaging in this ordinary physical kind of existence. But the truth, as I think Lewis sees it, is that there's a great deal of good in created nature, and of such a sort that it's well suited for helping human beings understand something about the divine and themselves realize their own highest possibilities. To put that more simply, for Lewis, I think the point is not to forget about or neglect ordinary natural life, but to see God's providence at work within it. Or if you like, to see that the ordinary is not just about profit, low pleasure, and entertainment, but that there's a divine hand watching over it and guiding it, and that it's the proper place to begin for living a life of devotion to God. Screwtape, it seems to me, is somehow aware of this problem with nature. Letter 15 is officially about the issue of living in the present. Screwtape actually, and somewhat surprisingly, I was surprised the first time I read this, sees living too much in the present as dangerous to his project, to his attempt to corrupt human beings. He would rather see people live in some imagined future than focus on their present duties or even their present pleasures. If the pleasures that people enjoy are natural, and if the good that they pursue, the goods that they pursue, are genuine, natural human goods, then not only is there no harm in pursuing them, they even help a person in his own formation. As Screwtape concludes in that letter, this is one of my favorite quotes in the novel, no natural phenomenon is really in our nature. Nothing in nature ever really serves the cause of devils, right? Now, what Screwtape prefers, as I mentioned, is the realm of the spiritual, right? Spiritual is not intrinsically a bad thing, Lewis says, but neither is it intrinsically a good thing. I won't read this passage out, but if you look at the end of his book on miracles, he has an appendix on the different uses of the word spiritual. If spiritual is taken in the sense in which it's sometimes used in Scripture as a life of devotion to God, in that sense, Lewis said, it's simply good. But if it's taken in the more ordinary sense, as that somewhat borderline supernatural part of human nature that is rational nature, that part of nature that angels and devils, the only part of human nature that angels and devils share, that unembodied intelligences share, that is something ambiguous, right? He says there's nothing more intrinsically good about the rational part of one's soul than there is about the physical part of one's soul. The question is how one directs it. So Screwtape's taste for this so-called spirituality, in contrast to and to the denigration of the physical created world, it seems to me is one of his great flaws. He even appears as a kind of perversion of a Manichaean, right? He sees the world as divided into a spiritual principle and a material one, and he cares about only the spiritual one, but he's twisted because in aligning himself with the spiritual principle, he believes he's aligning himself with the devil, right? So this is all to say that a natural human being for Lewis is not merely a spiritual being. That is, a human being is not simply his or her rational element. A human being, and here Screwtape is using a term that goes back at least as far as Aristotle, is an animal, right? Is a physical being that has something in common with the lower animals. I don't think it's a surprise that Lewis had a special interest in classical philosophy that focuses so much on that part of human nature. The twist that Lewis puts on it, the twist that he puts on it in his kinds of inversions of Screwtape, is to suggest that those simple things that we experience as natural embodied creatures can be part of a path that leads up to God, right? Now I want to make this, I see I'm a little short on time, so I'm going to cut a little bit and just explain one thing very quickly, right? One of the things that I love about this book is it's letter 15, where Screwtape advises Wormwood against even letting the patient read a book or go for a walk for pleasure, right? He says that puts him on the path to godliness. That might seem like a surprise because it's something that he's doing only for his own sake and only because he enjoys it, not out of any deep sense of devotion to God or love of the divine, but just because he feels like it. But as Screwtape recognizes, as even this devil recognizes, there is something about such pleasures that is unmistakably real. That's his phrase, right? If you enjoy going for a walk and having a drink, if you enjoy spending time with friends, if you enjoy reading a spy novel or something like that, not because the world admires you for it, but because you simply enjoy it, that puts you more closely in touch with your own human nature, right? And for Lewis, I think those experiences, ranging from simple pleasures all the way to love of another human being and devotion to country, those are the touchstones that put us back into contact with our full nature as human beings, right? And it's when we recognize those things, when we encounter them on a personal level, not just as abstractions, but when we experience them, that we're brought back to ourselves. And I would say that one of the remarkable things about Lewis's writing is this deep trust that he has that our true natural selves, right, the beings we really are in our hearts, if we can combat the bad tendencies of the world, and this is not so much a theme of Screwtape, combat our own tendency to sinfulness, those things are really a way that God has established for us, and we should embrace it, right? So, again, this is just my sketch of what Lewis means to defend against the tide of the modern world, right? A real, simple, natural, fully lived human life. Okay. So I want to say just one last thing in conclusion, right? And I'm happy to, as I said, happy to take questions. What I've tried to do is offer a kind of sketch of how Lewis tries to show some particular ways in which the modern world is, let's call it short-sighted, right? Particular bad habits of thought and particular obfuscations that it intends to instill. He indicates this largely by the conceit that they are the products of this diabolical plan. But I said at the beginning that not all of Screwtape's judgments are to be trusted. They may be neither honest nor true, right? I think that's the case somewhat with respect to the way that he treats modernity. He does talk about it as a kind of diabolical plot, but like all plots of devils, it will never be fully effective, and in what I would say is an elegant symmetry to the way that devils try to twist natural passions and make them the source of spiritual corruption. God has his way of taking diabolical projects and putting them to his own use. Now, please let me be clear. Lewis, I think, regards modernity as posing special dangers, and I think that he really wants readers to notice them, but that doesn't mean that he regards it as entirely bad. And I think it's one of Screwtape's confusions that he can't see the good, not unbalanced or unmitigated, but the good that modernity was meant to do and capable of doing. Lewis wrote one short sequel to this, and to explain that, I want to quote a line not from Screwtape directly. He wrote one short sequel to the Screwtape letters, a lovely little article called Screwtape Proposes a Toast. It's included in most, I see people smiling good, it's included in most editions of the Screwtape letters, or at least in the common edition of the Screwtape letters that people typically read today, right? The thought there, the story there is that Screwtape is delivering a toast to the annual dinner of the Tempters Training College for Young Devils. He speaks there about the great movement toward liberty and equality in the 19th century, and at that point, he's of two minds about how to treat it. he says, and here I quote, "It was not easy to determine what our attitude should be. On the one hand, it was a bitter blow to us, it still is, that any sort of men who had been hungry should be fed, or any who had long worn chains should have them struck off. But on the other hand, there was in the movement so much rejection of faith, so much materialism, secularism, and hatred, that we felt we were bound to encourage it." I think Screwtape captures something important in allowing that the modern world is not, and again, you do the inversion, right? Screwtape can't regard the modern world with unmixed celebration, so we cannot regard it with unmixed revulsion. The whole Screwtape letters does insist on virtually every page that there's something about it that separates us from ourselves and our natures. And the effect of the book, in my opinion, is to wake us up from a certain slumber. But I would also add that by means of books like this, it's possible for us to be woken up. That the modern age does not foreclose the possibility of living a life like the one that Lewis recommends, and if it erects certain new obstacles, it makes it possible, makes it more possible and more widely possible in other ways. So for all of the difficulties, I would say that the purpose of the book, one of the great purposes of the book, is to show how one can, even in the context of the modern world, live a life that is both Christian and naturally good, but that it makes it especially incumbent on us to be aware of the things in our context that militate against that. Thank you very much. So, Joseph, can I just stay as long as I want and take questions? Okay, people, I think at some point we'll do an official ending, but I'll hang out as long as people want. Yes, please.